Okay. So hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Danielle Pagani, and I am a COVID-19 generalist for the Village of Ridgewood Health Department, as well as a committee member for the Village of Ridgewood Stigma-Free Task Force. And I'm joined tonight by my colleague, Marianne, who is the Vulnerable Population Outreach Coordinator, Marianne Furman, and as well as several clinicians from the Lucan Center for Psychotherapy, which we'll have them introduce themselves in a couple minutes. But I want to give you a little background about the Village of Ridgewood Stigma-Free Task Force. So the task force was actually established in 2016 by Dawn Citrullo, who is the health officer of the village, as well as Rosemary Klee, along with other community members. So if you'd like more information about the task force, if you'd like to join to become a committee member, please feel free to email me. I'll put my email in the chat, or Marianne can do it for me. Sorry about that. But happy to send you more information. We're always happy to have more people involved. It's really a great committee to be on. So we are very excited for the clinicians that we are working with tonight from the Lucan Center for Psychotherapy. They are presenting on parenting in the pandemic, building resilience, coping, and connections within families tonight. So some of the topics that you may have, saw on the flyer include, the impact of COVID on children, parents, guardians, marriages, families, emotional acceptance of the new reality we all live in, as well as ideas for how to make most of the pandemic and quarantine, as well as other topics. So, I'll have each clinician introduce themselves in a couple minutes, but to give you a little background about the Lucan Center for Psychotherapy, they provide high quality evidence-based psychotherapy services to Ridgewood, Hoboken, Montclair, Englewood, and Jersey City communities. They are one of the largest psychotherapy practices in Northern New Jersey. They provide a wide array of services targeting adult mental health, as well as they have a child and adolescent program that is uniquely designed to the needs of, the requirements of children and teens. So for more information about the Lucan Center, you can visit their website, which is www.lucancenter.com. And of course, they're happy to answer your questions tonight. Before I turn it over to the first clinician, Melissa, please note that tonight's presentation is being recorded. So we'll have this, available on our website, the Village of Ridgewood website, which is ridgewoodnj.net, as well as our social media. And I'm sure the Lucan Center will be happy to share it, etc. So also we will be doing the question and answer portion at the end of the presentation. So you can put them in the Q&A box, throughout. We'll be watching it as well as the chat box if, you prefer to use that for any comments. So just keep that in mind. We'll do those towards the end. And if we don't get to your question for whatever reason, we'll make sure that we, save it and get it to the clinicians and, share your email address so we can, reply back to you. But with all that, I am looking forward to learning from all the clinicians tonight. And again, thank you all so much. And Melissa, feel free to take over.
Sure. Thanks for having us. So I'm Melissa Ferrero. I'm an LCSW, and I work with teens, parents, and adults at the Lucan Center. Going to keep it brief, and I guess I'll hand it off. Do we want to just go around? Alex, do you want to go next? You're muted.
Yes. Hi, my name is Alexandra Goncharova, and I work with college students, adults, and couples, mainly at the Lucan Center.
Hi, and I'm Kristen Estrella. I'm an LSCSW, and I specialize in working with children and adolescents and their families.
I can go next. My name is Timothy Meyer. I'm a psychotherapist here at the Lucan Center. I'm also the assistant clinical director. I work with adolescents, teens, adults, families, and couples.
Gabby, you want to go next?
Sure. So I'm Gabrielle Milani. I am the Senior Outreach and Clinical Intake Manager for the Lucan Center for Psychotherapy. So I do all of the outreach within the communities, as well as when you call in, you will actually talk to me so I can help Dr. Lucan pair you with whoever is the best fit clinician for you.
And my name is Dr. Konstantin Lukin. I'm the founder and the clinical director here. So typically after you call in and speak to Gabby, actually the next person that you'll be speaking with is myself. And one of my jobs is what I do is try to pair up the person who's calling with the best clinician here for their needs.
Andrea, you want to go next?
Hi, I'm Andrea Tesher. I'm a clinical psychologist at the center. I see adults and work with couples as well.
Alrighty, are we jumping into it? Okay. All right, so I'll go ahead and share my screen. One sec. All right, you guys. So thank you again for joining us tonight. I'm going to be starting us off with the first portion of our presentation, which is to discuss the impacts of the pandemic and the importance of emotions and acceptance of the new reality that we're in. So to start us off talking about impacts, I asked our staff to share with me 1 to 2 words of the challenges that they themselves have been facing, or clients that they've been working with that they've seen that they've been facing. And you'll see here, this is a visual image of that. Uncertainty, fear, guilt, confusion, amongst so many other things like social tensions, grief, loss, burnout. It's really been a heavy reality for all of us. And I know in large part, a lot of you are here tonight to kind of talk about, how to change or how to do things differently. But I really want to just emphasize that in order to even do that, it's really important that we talk about this concept of acceptance. So I'm going to share a quote with you that there is room for us to both accept where we currently are and to put energy towards where we want to go. And I say that because many of us, myself included, we can put a lot of energy into fighting our reality, which really keeps us from being able to change it. And when I say that, common ways is that we dwell, we overthink, we ask ourselves, why is this happening? Or I can't believe this is happening. And we put so much energy into these sorts of thoughts that it really takes away the energy from our ability to focus on what we do have control over and what we can change. So I'd like to share a tool with you that we often use in therapy, but you can also use in your daily life or even with your kids. And that's a tool that can help us just identify really what is in our control. And you'll see that here. And this is a blank version. And you'll see in the center is where you write down or you'll acknowledge what we have most or total control over. The second layer is what do we have some control over? And lastly, what do we not have control over? And in a sort of a watered down or easier version that sometimes we use with kids is just to take out that center section and just ask, what do we have control over right now? And what do we not? So here's an example of sort of a completed diagram. And you can go ahead and kind of read along as I'm going through major themes, because there's 2 themes or takeaways that I really want to emphasize. One of that is just that we really only have control over ourselves. So how we respond to challenges, how we take care of our body, how we get involved, how we communicate. And then the second takeaway is that, our control is limited, or it just doesn't exist when we're talking about things outside of ourselves. So, example of something we may have some control over is our work schedule or how people support us, because we can communicate or we can ask for help. But ultimately, we really don't have control over how they respond, how they think, how they feel. And then also just even the existence of COVID or the situations we may find ourselves in, like needing to quarantine or schools closing. So again, this is important to acknowledge because we can waste a lot of energy focusing on that outside circle instead of that inside circle. And that being said, though, that doesn't mean that this is necessarily an easy thing to do, which brings me kind of to my next point that, just because we can acknowledge and write down what do I have control over versus what I don't, doesn't mean that we're not going to have a lot of emotions about it. And it doesn't mean that there's not going to be, you know, challenges in being able to really accept and learn to cope with that reality. So that kind of brings me to my next point of accepting also our emotions around our reality and these difficult times that we find ourselves in. So I'm going to share with you this concept of dialectics. I really like this concept of holding two truths. So some circumstances like the pandemic, right, are going to evoke challenging emotions, and that's okay. And it's also okay to explore and create opportunities to feel differently. So here's a little bit more to elaborate on that. You can give yourself permission to have difficult feelings or feelings around the things you can't control, like sadness or disappointment. And you can also give yourself permission to take charge of things or change the way that you feel, to feel better, to feel grateful, or to feel happy. And this is important because if you only get stuck in the difficult feeling, you miss out on the opportunity for healing and to feel better. But if you ignore the difficult emotions, you also really don't learn to process them or to tolerate those emotions. Right. So, you know, for example, so many of us are going through such drastic changes in how we connect with people, how we celebrate things. You know, one of my really good friends got married over YouTube, and I had to watch her get married over YouTube. And I'm sure so many of you also, even over this past holiday, had to celebrate over, you know, a virtual platform instead of in person. And can there be difficult emotions around that? Can you feel disappointed? Absolutely. And you can also feel joy and gratitude, right, for your ability to still connect or to take kind of control over being able to connect in some way. So when I talk about this concept of dialectics, I think it's pretty obvious that we want to feel better, that we want to feel happy, that we want to feel, you know, those positive emotions. And I think the part that a lot of people struggle with is being able to really give yourself permission to have those difficult emotions, which kind of brings me to my next point of why feel. Why is it important to acknowledge and make space for those difficult emotions like sadness and grief? And, you know, in that, you know, to kind of elaborate on that, I think this is something that most of us do, is that we label emotions as good or bad, right? That happiness is good, sadness or grief is, or, you know, rejection, those sorts of emotions, they're bad, and we don't want to feel them, we want to avoid them. But pushing those emotions away doesn't actually make them go away, right? They typically come out in other forms, and you'll see that probably in yourself or even your kids, that suppressed emotions come out as belly aches, headaches, irritability, right? So pushing them away is unhelpful. Another way that it's unhelpful to push away those difficult emotions is that it makes us less able to deal with them when they come up again, because they will come up again. You know, sadness and disappointment are part of the human experience. So, you know, the more that we push them away, the more we're really preventing ourselves from ever being able to learn how to deal or cope with them. So those are some reasons why it's unhelpful to push them away. But I also want to share with you why emotions are important and why they serve a purpose. So one reason is that emotions motivate us. Emotions are signals on how to act in a particular situation. Emotions also communicate. So they can help us communicate to others, to help them understand us, and also help us understand others when they communicate emotions to us. And lastly, emotions signal a need. So they can signal to us that something's important to us or something that we value, but also often they signal to us that we need something in that moment when we're having that particular emotion, which I'm going to get into a little bit more in depth in the next slide, of emotions and their purpose. So emotions and their purpose, and you can kind of look through these, but I'm going to focus on sadness, and I'm going to use the example that maybe you or your child or your family can relate to in the pandemic, that there's been some sort of letdown or loss, maybe a vacation that you planned for, or some big event that that you were really looking forward to got canceled or you couldn't go. And you or your child, right, you may cry, you may withdraw, you may mope because that thing didn't end up getting to happen. And that's a healthy response. Right, sadness is a healthy response to that sort of loss, and what it's signaling is the need for healing, and healing may be, you know, just time and patience, but it also may be some sort of restorative activity or experience, like a staycation, or some sort of you know, special activity that you can do rather than maybe the vacation. But again, I just want to emphasize that it's serving a purpose and it's communicating something. And in this also, I think it's important for us to remember that, you know, as adults and parents, the more that we can acknowledge the purpose of emotion, that we can embrace the difficult emotions, that we're also modeling, right, for our kids, that emotions are okay even when they're painful. That, you know, if there's a difficult emotion, if you're not, you know, us as parents, right, or adults, not judge ourselves for having that experience, we're also teaching our kids not to judge themselves for having sadness or anger or fear. So, you know, it's something that we're constantly modeling. And one caveat to that is, you know, because I think this is sort of a perfect kind of, you know, action, communicate, need sort of depiction. You know, it's not to say that emotions can't become dysregulated. They can, right, through, you know, because of maybe a certain disorder, a mood disorder, substance use, trauma, and things like that. But, you know, the big takeaway I want you to have here is that emotions are important, even when they're difficult, and they do serve a purpose. So I'm going to share with you now some strategies on how to do that. How can you give yourself permission to feel, even if those feelings are difficult? And this also is something you can model again and teach your kiddos. And so here's some kind of basic ways. One way is to create space. Create space in your day to have the feelings. Sit with them, take a pause. You may use music to evoke a certain emotion, or even meditation is a great way to create space. Another way is to express yourself. Find a way to maybe independently express yourself through poetry, art, journaling, blogging, or express yourself by communicating with loved ones, friends, or colleagues, to alleviate, you know, maybe that distressing emotion that you're holding on to. Another way is self-talk. So, you know, how are you talking to yourself about these emotions? How are you, you know, speaking to yourself either internally or outward, and being able to actually validate yourself when you're having difficult emotions. And lastly, this is a big one, is to not judge yourself. You're not a bad person. You're not awful or wrong for having painful emotions. They really are a very basic human experience that we're supposed to have. And again, this is something that when we can learn to embrace, that we really can teach and model for our kids. So I hope that this was helpful and you got some takeaways, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it off now to Alex to talk about coping and building resilience.
Thanks, Melissa. Hi again, everyone. My name is Alex, and I'm going to be talking about building resilience in your families during the pandemic. So one of the main findings in research on resilience is that people who bounce back from traumatic circumstances, they practice what Melissa was just speaking about. They're able to accept what they can't control, and they focus their energy on what they can control instead. And we could probably agree that this is much easier said than done, especially under conditions of stress. So if you look, slide please. So if you look at these common challenges that people have been experiencing since the pandemic started, for example, getting through daily tasks despite stress and negative feelings, and a very common one that we've been seeing, couples being able to kind of fairly divvy up parenting and household tasks and responsibilities, being able to empathically support each other. You can imagine how your psychology and how you cope, it could really impact how effective you are in solving problems. So this is why I'm going to be focusing on the concept of psychological flexibility. This is something that's heavily researched. It's a trait that is associated with resilience, reduced stress, and improved well-being. And actually, in a number of recent studies, it's been shown to contribute to improved coping with the COVID pandemic in particular. So hopefully what we'll cover next could help you and your families feel and connect better and to cope in ways that support you in solving your specific individual challenges. Slide, please. So psychological flexibility is our ability to be open, to be present, and to do what matters, irrespective of how we're feeling. And the extent to which we're psychologically flexible, it plays a really key role in resilience and how well we adapt to constantly changing situational demands, which makes it so relevant, I think, to the pandemic. And when psychologists measure people on this trait, they focus on 6 concepts, which all kind of work together. And I'm going to cover those now. Slide, please. The observing self. So building psychological flexibility, it involves changing how you relate to your mind. And the observing self is basically a place from which you could observe your experience without getting caught up in it, kind of like what you see on the right, that image on the right. And getting distance from your mind in this way, it can really make intense feelings feel much more manageable. And most importantly, it prevents reactive, impulsive decision making. Slide, please. Melissa spoke quite a bit about this topic of acceptance of our emotional reality and how you could practice this. So what are some signs that there is a lack of acceptance, especially during this time? You might notice intrusive, difficult thoughts, like, again, what Melissa was kind of describing. Why is this happening? When is this going to end? And also a struggle with these thoughts, kind of like what you see on the left on the slide. And it could be really tempting to over rely on social media or internet research to kind of ease your anxiety and get reassurance, but just be mindful of this specific impact that this has on you in particular, and set limits, because it does impact people differently. And set limits if you have to, if you see that it's not really helping you. Challenges with acceptance can also, this is actually very important, they can result in avoidance behaviors, and basically that's coping through distraction and through various addictions. And there are so many kinds of addictions that we engage in, which they give you immediate relief, but they significantly impair your resilience in the long term. And this is, I think, very important, that there is no shame in the fact that this is how we cope. Evolutionary psychologists, they actually say that we're wired with a negativity bias. It's a tendency to fixate on negative information and to kind of want to move away from anything that our mind is labeling as bad. And it's just important that Melissa, like as Melissa mentioned, that pushing away negative emotions, this could come at a major expense of time and energy we can spend on things that matter, and could actually result in some positive change. So try to notice if this is something that you're doing and curb the ways that avoidant coping can come up in your family. You might also notice that intense feelings like fear and grief and sadness, they come in waves, and it's important to try to lean into and ride these waves. Like waves in an ocean, emotions are inevitable, and you're better off doing what we call emotion surfing than fighting off these waves. If you could do this, you're going to be less inclined to cope with avoidance. Day-to-day acceptance also involves, I think, expanding our sense of what's normal and what's okay. So can you consider what is neglected in your home right now, today as we speak, or on your to-do list, with self-compassion, and kind of accept that this is understandable and it's a temporary reality that we're facing right now. Slide. What makes practicing acceptance really hard is that we're often fused with our thoughts and feelings, meaning we're experiencing them as truths. And since this is a major factor in depression and anxiety, we address it a lot in therapy. We want to help people get some distance from what they feel. And there are many ways to do this. I really like the metaphor of life as a bus and you're the driver, and unwanted thoughts are kind of like annoying passengers on that bus. So you can learn to acknowledge that they're there, but not really get caught up in a struggle with them, and you can just keep driving and go about your day. Diffusion also allows you to imagine many more solutions to various daily problems, I think, than you normally would. because you can be more open-minded, for example, about who does what in the home these days, including what your kids could help out with. And you can imagine new possibilities for the kind of support you can get as caregivers. And socializing takes on many new forms. For example, someone had to defuse from the traditional concept of a birthday to come up with a touching idea of those kids' birthday parades that we've been seeing. Slide. Mindfulness, this is a really hot topic these days. So just really quickly, I want to say this is not about, because there are many myths about it, it's not about a blissful state of relaxation or positive feelings or an empty mind. It's about full contact with the present moment. And if you were asked to kind of sit and do nothing, this would be a really hard thing to do. The default mode that our mind is in is it's kind of wandering between past, future, and present. And this is something that's really normal. Again, this is a part of how we evolved. It's given us an advantage. So the problem is not so much that we get lost in thoughts about the future or the past, but that it's sometimes really hard to flexibly come back to the present. And regular meditation can train your brain to actually get better at this. But you could also practice, you don't have to do meditation. You could practice just by taking a minute or even several seconds to kind of come in full contact with what's happening in the here and now. There's an exercise called the 5 senses exercise. So you can just connect with one of your senses or all of them and notice something that you smell or see or hear. And this is actually also great to use with kids. Mindfulness, you'll see that it kind of reaps many rewards. Calm is going to be easier to come by. You'll feel more connected in your daily interactions. And mindful parenting, like listening with full attention or pausing before reacting, can help kids regulate their emotions. Mindfulness can also be really helpful in taming that runaway worry train that can be really disruptive in the course of the day. So let's say there's a worry about a COVID test result or a school closure. It can help you kind of remain calm and continue doing what you have to be doing. And staying present also helps make moments of joy much more noticeable and accessible, because you don't get caught up in stories about the day or how it's going. And so even in the course of a really, really stressful day, you could still immerse yourself in a really delicious meal. You can have a sweet moment with your kids and even experience unexpected calm. So mindfulness is also relevant to work as well. Multitasking is really common right now because we're trying to do everything and get everything done, but it's been shown to be accompanied by a rise in stress hormones, actually, and including adrenaline. So it can have a negative impact on our minds and bodies. So try doing one thing at a time and doing it mindfully. Monotasking, it can reduce fatigue and stress, and it can have actually also benefits to your productivity and work. Slide, please. So in times of stress, it's very easy to have a good sense of what we don't want to be happening. We're not as tuned in sometimes to what we would like things to be like. So these days, it's very easy also to fall into this holding pattern where we're kind of waiting for the pandemic to end before we start pursuing what matters to us. Every day, though, we're constantly encountering what we call choice points, and these are opportunities to kind of move away from or towards our values or what matters to us. And if we're not clear on how we'd like to behave or act, we end up living, again, reactively. We're going to include some material to help you clarify your values, but even right now, as we're sitting here right now, you could kind of think to yourself, who would you like to be as a parent or a spouse? What would you like your day-to-day in your home to look like? What are your current priorities for yourself and for your family? 5 years from now, how would you wish you were handling this period of your life? So clarifying what matters and making towards moves can help you in difficult daily decisions, and it will reward you in the long term. Slide, please. And lastly, committed action. Moving towards values really sounds great in theory, but you're going to find that it's really hard in practice because you're going to encounter internal resistance. So I'll use the value of self-care because a lot of us are trying to practice this to manage stress. In the pandemic, self-care might mean tolerating some guilt or self-criticism as you're getting takeout for the 5th night in a row. It might mean or letting your kids have more screen time so you can get through the day. It might mean tolerating disappointment and a sense of unfairness as you choose to be less ambitious at work, since you know that your mental health would suffer if you try to do it all. And so try to notice your choice points throughout the day and see if you could pivot when you're tempted by an away move and confront those difficult feelings. Slide, please. So I want to leave off on this positive note. Many parents are worrying about the long-term impact of the pandemic on their kids' mental health. And this is what we know. First of all, it's not stress itself, but how we cope and perceive stress that predicts outcomes. Though some people are predisposed through nature and nurture to be more resilient, we can actually develop resilience and psychological flexibility through effort and practice. How we cope as parents impacts our kids' resilience. So first of all, we're modeling healthy or unhealthy coping with our own responses. And also, in stressful circumstances, kids look to us to see how they should be feeling. And if we're not managing how we feel in healthy ways, we're passing on distress to them. And post-traumatic growth, which you see in this slide, for me, like the really hopeful message is that in the majority of cases, it turns out that people emerge from difficult experiences like the pandemic, having experienced post-traumatic growth, meaning we leave these experiences feeling stronger, more compassionate and connected to others, more grateful, more spiritual. We have a sense of greater possibilities. So just consider that. And lastly, I just want to say that there are many aspects of our kids' lives to concern ourselves with as parents, but please know that when it comes to resilience, the relationship that you have with your kids is the most protective in times of stress, and it's most predictive of how they're going to do later on in life. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Kristen, who's going to speak about ways to build connection with your children during this really, really challenging time. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. So my colleagues have talked about several ways we can learn to accept the new reality we live in and how to build resilience and adaptive coping within ourselves as adults. And now I'd like to talk about how we can pass on these techniques to children and adolescents. Slide, please. So as we all know, kids continue to face mental health challenges due to COVID-19, and they often show us they're struggling through their behaviors, which is why we often view behaviors as really the tip of the iceberg with all the emotions underneath. Slide, please. When we look at how anxiety presents in children and adolescents, some of the behavioral signs they show us are clinginess, avoidance of certain situations, restlessness, irritability, and so on. Slide. Similarly, depression often manifests in behaviors such as not enjoying or wanting to do fun activities, self-criticism, difficulty paying attention, irritability, and appearing kind of unmotivated or sluggish. Slide, please. So children often demonstrate these behaviors when they feel alone with their emotion. So in order to get to the layers underneath and the feelings underneath, children really need to feel seen, heard, and accepted. It's very difficult for children to go to their parents for support if one of these elements is missing. And thankfully, we can do this by creating time and space to listen that also respects your child's development. I know this may seem like a really basic concept, but as adults, we often do a lot of the talking and telling, and to be effective in helping children of all ages, we really need to do more of the listening and wondering. For elementary age children, you can create meaningful listening time with them by allotting 10 minutes of what I call special time. So special time is essentially child-led play with your child, and we use play because this continues to be the most natural form of release for children, and it's really how they communicate their inner world to us. For older children and adolescents, you can do this by stepping into their world and joining in with whatever they're interested in, whether it's computer games or video games, a particular show, baking, TikToks, and so on. And by also allowing them to join your world by letting them be part of the family decision-making and discussion process when appropriate. Slide, please. So learn some different ways to interact with your child that foster listening. We're going to turn to what I call the pride skills. So these skills were designed with elementary age children in mind, but they can be applicable to adolescents and adapted based on the development. So essentially these skills are evidence-based, and they're the same skills that child therapists use to build strong connections with children and really enhance the relationship. They help with feeling expression, emotional regulation, cooperation, and overall create a more mutual, enjoyable interactions between parents and children. Slide, please. So before I get into the pride skills, I want to really quickly go over what we call the don't skills. And these are things we really try to avoid just saying during special time with children and with teens. So we want to stay away from commands, which are phrases like don't worry, put the Lego here to stop it from falling, or you can draw this to fix your picture, because they tell children what to do and how to feel and really prevent them from thinking for themselves, problem solving on their own, and tolerating their emotion, which are all the skills they really need to manage anxiety and depression. Questions are also avoided because they take the lead away from children. Because really, when we're asking a question, we're also expecting an answer. And too many questions can seem like an interrogation, which is why we often get very little when we ask children or teens a ton of questions about how their day was at school, what did you do, who'd you talk to? So we really want to allow children and adolescents the space to share what's coming up for them. And lastly, we want to avoid criticism, which often includes words like no, don't, and stop, because these are already trigger words for kids. And these statements really point at mistakes rather than providing correction. For example, when we say something like stop crying or don't be sad, these are critical in that they invalidate their feelings and internal experiences. As Melissa discussed, we need emotions, so we don't want to get rid of them for children. And these three are actually really hard to avoid. So that's why we're going to turn to the pride skills to figure out what we can say that's going to really help the relationship and help children cope with difficult emotions. So I'm going to go over each letter and give you an example of what that would look like. Slide, please. So P is for labeled praise, which are statements that very specifically point out behaviors you are appreciative of. Like, I love how you kept trying your hardest to figure out a way to build that tower. Thanks for sharing that TikTok video with me. I really appreciate you sharing your feelings with me because I can know it can be really hard sometimes. These statements increase desired behaviors, they help with self-esteem, and they make both of you feel good. And praise is really a way to verbally confirm our belief that they can manage their distress or failure. Then we have R, which is for reflect appropriate talk, which is essentially repeating or paraphrasing what your child is telling you. For example, if your child shares that they're building a house, you could say something like, yeah, you're working really hard to build that house. Or if they're sharing they don't think their drawing is very good, you can reflect, wow, you're really thinking your drawing isn't that good. And even throw in, I wonder how you're feeling about that, just to deepen our curiosity. This strategy is so important because it really shows that you're actively listening and that you accept their experience, which in turn validates their thoughts and feelings. This is the same concept Alex was referring to when she was discussing radical acceptance, because again, we're not trying to change or get rid of feelings. We're just trying to help children feel less alone with the feelings so they can accept it and move on. Then we have I, which is imitate appropriate play. And this is basically where you just copy what your child's doing. So if they're building a tower, you'd start building. Or if they're beginning to get upset, you can also imitate some agitation with the activity and model a coping skill to demonstrate how to bounce back without telling them what to do. This again allows them to take the lead and feel in charge, which also increases their imitation of things you do because kids learn by modeling. For adolescents, you can imitate by joining in with whatever activity they're doing, like sitting with them while they're watching a TV show, showing genuine interest with them while they're playing Roblox, or with whatever video game they're playing. Then we have D, which is describe positive things your child's doing. So behavior description is really similar to what sports announcers do when they're giving a play-by-play of what's going on in a game. So again, if you're playing chef, you'd narrate something like, oh, you're flipping the pancakes, now you're putting them on the plate. Or if they're starting to get anxious and fidgety, you can describe, wow, your body's really wiggling. I think it's trying to tell us something. I wonder if it might need a break, if it has to go to the bathroom. So this helps your child know you're paying attention and also helps increase their attention span and body awareness. Since anxiety and depression present a lot in physical symptoms, we want them to start connecting their feelings with their body signals. And this is a nice non-judgmental way to do that, because when we note and narrate what children do, it also pulls their attention to the moment. And it's really a technique that's actually used as part of mindfulness that Alex was talking about. You can also even narrate your own thoughts and feelings and behaviors related to the activity or interaction to help model feeling expression. And last, but definitely not least, we have E for enjoy, which is just showing genuine interest with your child during your time with them through tone of voice, laughing, a gentle touch, or just verbally sharing that you're really enjoying your time together. I know this one also might seem very basic, but when there's been a lot of tension and stress in our lives and in the relationship, it's super important that kids and teens know that you're enjoying your time with them and that they are a priority. And this really creates warmth and closeness in the relationship. And again, opens the door for kids to share difficult feelings. I want to point out that these skills are more important than ever if kids have to quarantine, and they can actually be built into your quarantine schedule, which I'm going to really briefly talk about. Slide, please. So essentially, children, adolescents, and us adults need routine to feel safe and secure, which is why this pandemic has really thrown us all out of sorts. So that's why I recommend even creating a quarantine schedule before you get thrown into one, to have an idea of how to have some consistency in the inconsistent. Ideally, you'd try to keep the quarantine schedule as close to the typical schedule as possible. And this is where maybe reevaluating, your values comes into play. I know it could be really tempting to let things slide, like brushing teeth or wearing pajamas all day, but this really makes the transition back to school that much more difficult and can really affect their mood. Because I can tell you, if I'm wearing pajamas all day, I'm not going to be doing much. I'm just not going to be productive. Just kind of signals to our brain, rest or not. However, this is where the and comes into play. So we can have a schedule as best as we can and still have flexibility, because the reality is it's not typical to be thrown into a quarantine. And that's where you can have some kind of playfulness, right? Like planning a special pajama day for the family where you wear special pajamas. And I also recommend making a visual schedule of what the day will look like and reviewing it the night before and the morning of, so kids know what is expected of them, and even including them as part of the process. And this is where building in that special time and bonding time is more important than ever, because it creates connection currency. When we children what to do, like, please go play on your own or get dressed, we're essentially spending that currency. And we meet resistance when we haven't built it up enough. So that's why I think it's just important to include the special time if you can. I also think it's really important to incorporate a range of activities such as physical movement to help regulate their emotions and bodies. And slide. And really any of these activities on this list to just kind of give them a different range of things they can do. So I know we've covered a lot today, so I'd love to take time to hear if anyone has any thoughts, feelings, or questions about what we've talked about today.
So what we can do is have everyone, if anyone has comments or questions, write them in the Q&A box or the comments section. We do have one so far. So one person wrote, I am interested in ways to help a teenager who frequently feels loneliness, being unable to create meaningful relationships in school, feeling unhappy, especially returning from the school. So he turns to looking such relationships in miscellaneous social networks. I guess which one would you like to take?
I mean, I guess jump in. A couple of things come to mind just to consider. I mean, obviously it's hard to make suggestions just based on the question itself, but a couple of things that come to mind, in terms of how to potentially develop strong relationships, even if you're an adolescent or an adult. One thing to consider, if the adolescent is struggling just with anxiety, some sort of an anxiety disorder, potentially social anxiety. A lot of kids and adolescents, specifically during this time, or even before the pandemic, struggle in making connections and potentially making some sort of negative statements about themselves. So if there's a way to kind of get, maybe using some of the strategies that Melissa, Alex, and Kristen talked about to get to have the adolescents speak freely about what's going on, potentially would give some clues to what is actually going on internally, and that could be used as guidance in terms of what to do next, whether to be able to help the adolescent, bond with somebody at school, be it maybe addressing it with a therapist to talk through some more effective strategies in terms of how to interact with the with the other students at school. So that's definitely one way to potentially think about how to address this situation.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Does anyone else have any questions, comments?
So I have a question. So how would folks be connected to your services or services like this?
I guess I can jump in on that. I think the easiest way is the way you guys started in the beginning. I think the easiest thing to do is go on the website. We try to do our due diligence to show all the services that we offer, be it psychotherapy. I think you guys mentioned in the beginning that we do service a lot of different populations, from child, adolescents to adults. We also work, some providers here work with couples and families. So anything that you need during this pandemic time or after is definitely something that we'd be able to provide. I guess 2 points maybe to mention, then above and beyond, even though the heart of the practice is really psychotherapy, evidence-based psychotherapy, we do offer also what's called assessment and testing in case kids or adults require something like a neuropsych evaluation, or to address if there's a learning disability or an IEP that's needed. So we definitely do that as well. And recently we've also added psychiatric services. So either for adults or kids and adolescents. So as you can probably tell, what we're trying to develop is more of kind of like a comprehensive mental health hub. So if you can call in, whether you can come here to get those services, or we also have a lot of resources in the area. So even if you're not coming to the practice, feel free to call and you'll talk to Gabby and or myself to kind of figure out what would be the best place. And given that we're at 5 different locations, we're able to kind of hopefully point you in the right directions, regardless of which office you call.
And I just want to kind of go off of what Dr. Lucan just mentioned, that even if you're kind of having thoughts or questions like, should I call, should I not call? You can call, you talk directly to me, and I can kind of just talk things out with you, like how you might be feeling. My child's exhibiting this. What does this look like? What do you think? I'm definitely here to help guide. And, like Dr. Lucan said, we'll either find someone for you if they're not within our center, but even if you just want to make the call, just to have someone to discuss a few things, I'm here.
Also, would the schools be able to use you as a source? Would that be something that you guys are open to?
Sure. If any schools would like to reach out, absolutely. Again, the best way probably would be to call and speak to Gabby. And then, whatever they would need, either just services for maybe for some of the students, or teachers or anything like that, or just as resources that we might be able to help with.
Thank you.
Awesome. We do have another question that came in. So we have, how do you suggest keeping college-age students on a normal day night schedule, not staying up until morning?
I can jump in and share some thoughts on this one. So I think it's particularly hard, especially now with people, mostly staying inside. I think like our sleep-wake cycle, it's really easy to mess it up with the fact that we're not really getting out, doing more, etc. So I can rattle off like a handful of things. I think routine is super important. Not only wake up time and bedtime, but the consistent routine throughout the day as well. Light obviously has a huge factor in our sleep-wake cycle. So making sure that that's really nice and dark at nighttime, turning off the lights maybe around 9 or 10 p.m. and then keeping the shades open during the daytime. Melatonin helps a lot of people, but really it's about kind of consistency and routine. I think a lot of teens and young adults, it's really sort of enticing and easy to stay up late, sleep in late, and then that could really shift the sleep schedule over. When I'm working with it with people, I sort of work it in like 2-hour increments and try to really work it back to where we want it to be. And also probably the hardest thing about it that I've seen people avoiding naps, right? Because when we're moving that sleep schedule up a little bit, we feel super tired during the day. And if we take a nap, then that can really derail a lot of things. So there are a lot of sleep hygiene habits that a lot of us work with and a lot of us know about, but those are probably the top 3 or 4 that I can think of.
I also kind of wanted to add to that I think motivation is very important here. And so a lot of times people know all of these things that Tim mentioned, but there isn't that motivation to actually go and do that. And I do feel like I see this a lot in college students, that they're staying up very, very late. I think what can help with the motivation piece is kind of talking to the college student about, or the person about, what is this doing for you? How is this working for you? And kind of seeing maybe what are the ways it's not working, and kind of talking about that, because that can elicit motivation to actually do something and change. And also maybe having realistic kind of expectations about it. Maybe you're not saying like you got to go to bed at 10, but maybe, 1 is better than 3 or 4.
And also potentially, I'm thinking that a parent probably asked the question. So I'm also wondering, in today's world, especially with like social media or phones or computers, is that really, is that technology making into the bedroom where the adolescent sort of, or the young adult, I should say, has access to that during the nighttime? Then that could obviously make it very enticing for anybody, young adult or not, to stay on the phone or on the computer rather than go to bed. And so that's definitely something to consider. And maybe piggybacking on what Alex and Tim had said, maybe talking about some of the motivational factors, and then instead of like making big jumps, instead of going to sleep at 5 a.m., going to 10, maybe making it so that it's incremental, which may be frustrating in itself, but it's a much more effective strategy going from 5 a.m. to 4 a.m. than from insisting somehow taking it away and then insisting like, well, 10:30 is bedtime, which obviously oftentimes backfires. So just something to consider.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for, your detailed response. I have a question actually. So I guess, me and Marianne were talking earlier, and just it came out of like, what would you, I guess, say to somebody, or, a family that is kind of, I guess, ambivalent, or they're unsure of reaching out, for therapy services, what would be your, I guess, advice or suggestion, to that person or family who's kind of like unsure if they're ready for that step?
I mean, one thing that comes to mind to me, at least, would be is the concern in terms of starting. I mean, at least here, if you call in and speak to Gabby, I mean, we are more than, I guess, just a therapy center. We're trying to be like a resource as well. I mean, sometimes a lot of people potentially, when they're thinking making appointments, maybe they equate it to like making an appointment with a physician or a psychiatrist, where there's kind of like, I don't want to say an expectation, but there's a sense they're going to be like diagnosed and given a script and they have to take medication. It's a whole thing. Therapy is not like that at all. And definitely here, it's not like that. You could call in, as I mentioned, talk to Gabby, and then she could kind of help you figure out, is this really the right step for you? Or maybe you're looking for something different. So there's less commitment. And therapy in whichever form is, again, very different from medication. So there's not this like pressure to come take the whatever the physician prescribed. Here, it's more of a conversation. So hopefully the first phone call could exactly be that, just an exploration.
I think to add to that too, just being mindful that, I think sometimes the barriers, like people are like, I'm not really sure like what I want to work on, or I'm not really sure, like something is off, or, I'm just not feeling like myself, or maybe it's really just generally like not knowing exactly like, specifically what they want to work on or what their goals are, and just being mindful too that like sometimes that's part of the process too. Like when you start meeting with someone and start therapy, that you have someone to kind of sit with you and kind of process and explore some of those things. And kind of like Dr. Lucan said, that there's no pressure. Like you could experiment and try it and explore what you think you want to work on and what you need. And you may realize that you don't need it. And there's no pressure to stay. There's no binding contract. So like even that, if that's sort of a barrier, just kind of being mindful that like, it's okay to also not know what your goals are. We're here for that, to help with that too.
Yeah, and I mean, Melissa, I think that's an excellent point, because sometimes when people call in, they think it's like there's like a compulsory thing that you would have to come in, or there's like bundles that you have to like pay up front or something. Like nothing like that exists. So it's potentially unique in that sense, unlike you go anywhere else. Let's say if you go to the gym and you pay monthly or something like that. In therapy, even that idea doesn't exist at all. So it's very easy to try and stop, or try and continue, or just call and find out resources, or maybe even talk to Gabby or myself in terms of like maybe therapy isn't the right move for you at this time.
Awesome. Thank you both.
Okay, so it seems like we don't have any questions, so we're going to wrap it up. I want to thank everybody for attending tonight's presentation, and I want to thank the Lucan Center of Psychotherapy for providing this presentation. It was excellent and very informative. I learned way more than I even anticipated, so thank you for that. The information is very useful, especially during these times. These are really rough times for all. And a special thank you to Gabrielle for building this connection and making this presentation happen. So thank you so much for that. As a reminder, this presentation was recorded, and we will be putting it on social media and on the Village of Ridgewood website as well. If you have any questions, you can please email Danielle. She has her email on the chat box. And thank you again. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
I'm going to go ahead and share the link to access those supplementals. I forgot about that.
I'll also share on our social media as well. And if we also have Instagram, Facebook, we also have a newsletter. So if you want to be added to it, please add your email into the chat box, and I will add you onto our newsletter as well.
A last thing before we go, I think Gabby, didn't you also, I think, wanted to share something like a free resource?
Yeah, Melissa's doing it.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah, so
We
that's, yeah.
So there's that, and then there's from Danielle. Did you have that other email from, I think, Lauren or Laura?
I don't have it on saved, but it's okay. I'll post it on social
Okay.
media. And as well as we could post your resources when we post on social media and our website too. We'll make sure
Perfect.
it's all together.
Okay, great.
But thank you all so
All right,
much.
thank you,
This is
everyone.
great.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Have a great night.
Thank
Stay
you.
safe. Stay warm. Snow is coming. Thank you, Dylan.
You're welcome. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Okay.